our Tuesday afternoon lecture. We're very lucky to have a live lecture this afternoon, and also lucky to have two esteemed lecturers. Dr. Kevin Birch is the Director of Music at St. John's Catholic Church in Bangor, and he's also a faculty member of the University of Maine School of Performing Arts. He has his Doctor of Musical Arts degree from the University of Iowa, and he's performed throughout the United States, Europe, and South America. And our second lecturer will be Dr. Ansel Wieck, who is Professor of Music at the University of Maine, where he conducts the University of Maine Orchestra. He received his bachelor, master's, and doctoral degrees from the Juilliard School of Music in New York City, and he has also performed widely and conducted in Europe, North and South America, Israel, and Japan. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Birch and Dr. Wieck to lecture for us this afternoon, and with that, I will hand you over to Dr. Birch.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. For my part of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the life and works of Hildegard von Bingen, and looking more specifically at a piece of music that she composed and that has come down to us. Hildegard von Bingen was born in 1098 and is a very major figure in the history of medieval Germany for her roles as a seer, scientist, a writer, a preacher, an exorcist, a playwright, musician, poet. She was, in the later term, a polymath par excellence. Biographical information on Hildegard derives from her Vita, which is short for the Vita Sanctae Hildegardis, which appeared shortly after her death and was somewhat hybrid between a biography and an autobiography, in that she dictated much of it, and then much of it was completed by the monks who had done the dictations. This is a primary source for information about her life, and that she had a direct hand in it can't be undervalued in understanding who she was and what she was about. Despite being a cloistered nun, and for those who are not aware of what a cloistered nun is, it's a special kind of religious discipline where you remove yourself from the world and you live in a kind of an enclosure. So despite being a cloistered nun, she had a great impact on her time and the church in that time. She was consulted by popes and cardinals and all kinds of noble people. She provided advice, she provided all kinds of wisdom, and she's also very well remembered for her prolific creative contributions to science, to music, to theology. Hildegard was the youngest of 10 children, and her parents were of the aristocracy. Her father was likely a knight. Her parents were landowners, and it was not uncommon in these well-to-do medieval families of an aristocratic heritage to offer their youngest child to a religious community as a kind of a tithe. The Vita, or her biography, compiled by the monks in the decades following her life, provide her own accounts of being exceptionally gifted, even at an early age, with visions. And she describes her earliest memory of what would affect her for the rest of her life, this seeing visions. And she writes about that. In the third year of my life, I saw such a great light that my soul trembled, but because of my youth, I could not speak about it. Up to my 15th year, I saw many things and told about them in such a simple way that those that heard them wondered where they came from and from whom they came. At the age of 8, Hildegard was entrusted to a companion whose name was Jutta von Sponheim, and this Jutta von Sponheim was known as an anchoress, or someone who would take in a young person for religious formation. And she also possibly at that time took in another companion. So it was a small group of women who were in a kind of religious formation under the tutelage of Jutta von Sponheim. Jutta and her attendants would participate in religious formation, which would include learning about scripture, learning about liturgy, and practicing a kind of monasticism that wasn't yet fully professed monasticism, but it was almost a kind of an apprenticeship for the monastic life. This would have been accomplished in proximity to an existing monastery. And this monastery was in nearby Dissy-Bodenberg, the monastery of Dissy-Bodenberg. This is all in proximity to Frankfurt and Mainz on the Rhine River, which at that point would have been a superhighway in that part of the world. An anchoress and her charges would have been kind of a prestigious addition to any religious community. This kind of activity would attract attention in the form of visitors, of gifts, certainly a feeling from the families that sent these children there of support and of loyalty. And this also was a kind of a draw to encourage other women to commit to the religious life. We don't know to what degree they were enclosed, that is to say, to what degree they did not circulate among their families and throughout the region. This was not explicitly described in the biographies of either Hildegard or Jutta. But it's imaginable that their enclosure was a small and modest space, that it was attached to the church and community of Dissy-Bodenberg, and it is likely that they would have had the capacity to write letters to people in the outside world, their family, their friends, and that on some level that they were able to accept visitors. At a certain point, these women would make a formal commitment to the monastic life, and this happened, and I believe this is at 1112, and eventually Jutta passed away in 1136. So there's a few decades here where it's not very well documented from year to year what's happening, but we can see this all as a time of formation and as a time of living already a kind of monastic existence. After Jutta passes away in 1136, Hildegard is now 38 years old. And at that point, she was unanimously elected by the fellow women in the community to be the head of that community. And it's at this point, where Hildegard is 38 years old, that she begins to have an active work as a preacher, to be more public in a sense with her literary and her artistic work. Let's go back for a moment to these visions. It is very interesting that the phenomenon of these visions, which inspired much of her religious writing and her compositions, the visions were almost always coinciding with periods of illness in her life. And she declares at the beginning of an important collection of 26 visions called Skydias, details of the physical experience of receiving God's words. And she clarifies that despite her humility, God has commanded her to write and tell of what she sees. And in the vision, a voice commands her to write the visions of God as communicated to and through her. The illness apparently is part of her hesitation to actually record these visions and share them. And apparently the illness abates when she goes forward with documenting these visions. There's a very important sequence of her confiding about these visions with people in her circle and people who had authority over her. So she eventually begins by confiding to a monk named Volmar, Volmar. And Volmar was a monk at St. Disibod and was a prior, his position of leadership, and more significantly, I think, what's called a father confessor. In the Catholic tradition at that time and to this time, there is a sacrament of confession where someone will confide in their shortcomings, their sinfulness, in order to receive absolution. A father confessor is a kind of a spiritual director or a spiritual coach or someone who they can freely speak to about their about anything. And so it's not surprising that she would first confide to this monk Volmar. She later discloses her visions to the abbot of the monastery. Abbot comes from the word Abba, which is the word that means father. And the abbot is a kind of the father of the community or the authority over the whole thing. And an abbot has absolute authority in his monastery. As an abbess in a community of women would also have complete authority over the nuns in that abbey. So she discloses the visions to Volmar and then later to Kuno, the abbot of the monastery. And after the abbot questions her about the visions, he recommends that she continue to write down the visions as she's experiencing them. And he also, the abbot, reports about these writings to the Archbishop of Mainz. Mainz would be the seat of the Archbishop in that area. And the Archbishop would have the same kind of authority over the Catholic people in that region as the abbot would have over the monks in his monastery. So it was a position of authority and great power at that time. The Archbishop of Mainz would have been in contact with the Pope. And in fact, the Archbishop shares Hildegard's visions with the Pope Eugenius III. And after the Pope made an investigation through a papal commission, the Pope sends a letter of approval to Hildegard. And this serves as a kind of a sanction for her visions, and more importantly, gave her permission to share these writings publicly. And this recognition by the church authorities and the acceptance of her visions supports her claim that her message was indeed from God, and it serves to enhance her credibility and her visibility as a kind of a living, as a seer. So Hildegard's fame spreads, her community grows, primarily with women from noble families, and at a certain point she faces a difficult decision because of the growing community of women, the decision either to stay connected to this monastery at Disibodenberg or to break out and to expand into a monastery of her own. And no surprise, very difficult decision, and she grows ill. This always seems to happen at a time of great decision before she can move forward. And this illness was also accompanied by a vision. And in this instance, her vision indicated that she and her nuns should move to their own community. And they elected to build their monastery at Rupertsberg, which is about 40 kilometers away from Disibodenberg. Rupertsberg, if you look on the map, is much closer to the Rhine River. And I think we can't overstate the importance of these major waterways as being the superhighway, the airport system, everything important about movement and getting information from one place to another. It all depended on this waterway. So she moved basically to the shores of the Rhine River. And she establishes her own community. It's very interesting that this did not meet with approval from the brothers in the monastery. These women brought them money, they brought them fame, they brought them notoriety, all kinds of gifts, and they initially objected to the women leaving. The benefits were just too great. But seeing the seriousness of Hildegard's illness and the fact that she had a vision that said she should move, they finally acquiesced, and eventually they negotiated a settlement between the two establishments, and the women moved to Rupertsberg. The convent at Rupertsberg became a thriving establishment, and so thriving that within about 15 years or so, they were needing to actually build another monastery as a kind of an outpost to the one that they had started when they broke away from the brothers. Now, you folks have spent time reading the Ordo Virtutem, I believe, and there's an interesting connection between this morality play and the foundation of this monastery in Rupertsberg. The Ordo was completed around 1151, and the dedication of the church at Rupertsberg was in 1152. So it is likely that this morality play would have been performed by the women of the community as a kind of a special piece to perform for the dedication of the church. It's not proven, but it's likely because the Ordo Virtutem, not a liturgical piece, but more a piece that was non-liturgical and for a special celebration or a very important occasion. Given the scale of the Ordo, it is likely that it was something as major as the dedication of a new monastery or a new church. I would like to just go forward to a comment that Hildegard, very exceptionally for that time and for her role as a cloistered abbess, was able to embark on extensive preaching tours where she would travel extensively in order to preach. as a woman, as a cloistered nun, this is really exceptional and completely unheard of at that point. And so these preaching tours lasted well into her 70s. So as a 65, 70-year-old woman, she was making preaching tours. This would be like a concert tour or something. It's really significant. During her life, she wrote many letters, and there was a lot of correspondence, and this is well preserved. As a kind of a segue to the piece of music that we're going to talk about, I want to share a certain anecdote which brings a lot of these trends together. Hildegard, as the abbess, was involved in 1178 or 79. They buried a man who had been excommunicated, but apparently had received absolution prior to his death. Implicit in all of that is the power of the church to either grant someone the ability to be buried in consecrated ground or to deny them the ability to be buried in consecrated ground. So if someone is excommunicated from the church, at that point, they will not be buried in a sacred ground. This is very important at that time. And Hildegard and her nuns assumed or decided that because this excommunicated man had received absolution before his death, so absolution is a kind of a forgiveness or blessing at the end of life, and he had been absolved of his sins. But the clergy, the clerical power holders in Mainz would, of course, be watching carefully anything someone as famous and someone as powerful as Hildegard would be doing very carefully. And they did not approve of the nuns' decision to bury this man who had been excommunicated but also absolved. And so this was a great test of wills and a great test of power. And Hildegard was no shrinking violet. So apparently what happened is that the authorities mandated that this man be disinterred, so unburied, and be reburied in unholy ground. And the Hildegard and the sisters would have nothing to do with that. They were steadfast in their conviction that the man in question had received absolution and that their actions were right. So she and the nuns masked the man's grave, and Hildegard sought some kind of rectification or mediation so that they could resolve this issue. At that point, the authorities in Mainz sought to punish her and the sisters. And this is where it links to music. As a punishment, the nuns were supposed to cease all musical activity in the monastery, which included the ringing of church bells, the celebrating of public masses, and even in their private worship, they were required to recite the parts of the liturgy without the music that would normally have accompanied those texts. And in her letter responding to this punishment, she fiercely chastised those who meant to impose it. And in so doing, she describes the centrality of singing and of music in worship. So she writes the following: "The body is the vestment of the spirit, which has a living voice. And so it is proper for the body, in harmony with the soul, to use its voice to sing praises to God." And then she refers to the prophet David, who's the author of the Psalms, and she says, "The prophet, aware that the soul is symphonic and thoughtfully reflecting on the profound nature of the spirit, urges us in the psalm to confess to the Lord with the harp and to sing a psalm to him with 10-stringed psaltery." So she goes on a little further to say that this unjust punishment is also the work of the devil. And she closes the letter by analogizing God's vengeance to a female warrior battling against injustice. And 6 months before her death, this punishment or interdict was lifted. I'll just conclude this part of the talk with the date of her death. Hildegard dies in 1179 at the age of 82. And in her Vita, this biography, the monks,
look at this picture that I'm sending with Snapchat.
They describe her death in very spiritually charged language. They state that she died at twilight on a Sunday with 2 rainbows over her chamber, with a bright light and a red cross surrounded by circles of color reflected in the sky. It's a very wonderful description of her death by the monks. So this segues to a piece of music called O Virtus Sapientiae. I'll just hold up a piece of sheet music. This is the whole piece. And it is a piece describing the virtue of wisdom. O Virtus Sapientiae, O strength of wisdom, who circled, and closes all in one life-giving path. And this is significant here. 3 wings you have. 3 wings you have. This is a Trinitarian image. The Trinity is generally expressed Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In Hildegard's world, the Trinity is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So 3 wings you have. And each of the wings of wisdom describes, in a way, part of that Trinity. So one, it says, Quarum una in altum volat. One soars to the heights. This is the Father in heaven. One distills its essence upon the earth.
Just got a snapshot.
And the earth, one distills its essence upon the earth, is describing the Son of God, or Jesus, the incarnate, the one who became man. And the third, et tertia undique volat, and the third is everywhere, and that describes the Holy Spirit. So soars to the heights is the Father, distills its essence upon the earth is the Son, and the third is everywhere is the Holy Spirit. And then we praise you, God, through the Trinity. So that is generally what the text is describing. And this might be a good time just to have a musical contribution where I'll train the camera on the notes themselves and ask Professor Wieck if he would just play through a couple lines of the melody so that you can hear how it sounds. Let's do that.
Should I wait for the music to appear there, or?
Yes, let me just get it there.
Take your time, take your time. I have my music, so... Okay, here it is.
Thank you, Anatole. That is, you can already hear that it sounds like church music. It sounds like ancient Gregorian chant. This music is, it's built on a kind of a bass tone, or what we call a final, which is E, which is that first, can you see if I'm pointing to it?
Yep.
That E. And that's kind of the root of the tonality. Goes on for a while, but that first note is really it's the ground, it's the home note. Anatole, could you play an E again?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That opening fifth is kind of the two pillars of the harmony there, the E and the B. What else we can say about this music is that it's in the E mode, that the range of the piece goes slightly lower than that E to a C, and then it goes one octave above, and then a third above that to a G. I'll point to that G is right here. That's the high note. And primarily, this is what we call syllabic music, that is to say, one note for one syllable of the text. For example, here, one note for one syllable. But it also has what we call pneumatic elements. A neum, N-E-U-M, is a group of 2 or 3 or 4 notes over one syllable. So, for instance, yep. And that's a neum of 4 notes. A neum of 2 notes. And then something very special, which is called a melisma. And a melisma is one syllable with many notes over the syllable. And it's a way of kind of decorating to the highest level that particular syllable. So we have O virtus sapientia. And the O is expressed. Yes, Anatole, great. And you can see in that opening melisma, this E, and it returns to that E. And very prominent in the first part is this B. So you see the E and the B are important. So if I say that, so that gives you a flavor really of the tonality. The other thing that's very interesting about this is it's an example of what we call word painting. That is to say, the notes somehow paint a picture of what the word is trying to describe. So if we come down to una in altum, which means soaring to the heights, that G is the highest point in the piece, and it occurs on the word altum, which means height or high. It's really sung by a higher voice, but better than So that gives a bit of a flavor of the piece. You can see at the end, the very end of the piece, that it ends on the E, which is the final. So, yep. So that kind of tonality would be very consistent with what they would be singing in the Liturgy of the Hours or in the monastic experience in their prayer life as sisters and brothers. That might be a good point for me to just step back a bit and to ask, are there any questions specific to Hildegard or the monastic life, or maybe this piece in particular?
Can I add a quick thing before we go to questions? Just want to give a little bit of music history context. The music notation was invented just in a previous century, in the 11th century. So this is a relatively new technology. And the musical notation didn't really exist until the 11th century. And it was Guido from the town of Arezzo in Italy. He invented this whole system. And there is Hildegard. She's already using this system in order to write down the music. And then since, Kevin, you mentioned that this is kind of an example of drama in music. So she's kind of a predecessor of plays and also the opera, which did not appear until 16th century. So during those medieval times, if you wanted to see drama, it was impossible. However, the predecessor of the drama was in the church. And obviously, Hildegard is one of the pioneers of the art form that had to wait another several hundred years. That's another manifestation of her genius.
So true.
So please proceed with the questions.
It looks like we may not have any questions in the chat, but if there are any students that have questions for Dr. Birch, feel free to ask them now or hold them till the end.
Or we could proceed to the next subject.
Yeah.
I have a question on the music, like a musical question.
Sure. Please.
Yeah, my question is, did Hildegard know about the Greek musical notes, the Greek musical modes, what is it? I'm blanking out, but they had like Phrygia and Lydia and all those. Did they know?
Yes.
How did that affect it? Did they choose between the modes, or did they use some other modes?
That's a great question. She certainly would have been familiar with the church modes, which are related to the ancient Greek modes. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And so Hildegard would have certainly been familiar with the church modes. All of the music that they would be singing in the divine office was modal. And so whether it was in the Dorian mode or the Phrygian mode or the Aeolian mode or the Ionic mode, these church modes were correlated somewhat to that. But why your question is so wonderful is because Hildegard even stretched those boundaries. And in her music, there are some modes which are kind of mixtures of the church modes which are unique to her. So she was very innovative, certainly grounded in the tradition of modal music, but also expanding it at the same time. Great question.
It's a great question. May I add to this? For the students, obviously, it's honors college. We have very bright students there. But just for those that are not familiar with the modes. So here we have a mode for this particular text. Yeah. Yeah. So if that would be a regular major, this is how it would sound. Yeah. Or if it would be a minor, it would sound this way. But since it's a mode. So, and they used the church modes in the medieval times. Then, sometime in what, 17th century, 18th century, we just went to use the regular major and minor, and then it had to wait another couple of hundred years until the 20th century before the musicians, composers start using the modes all over again. You know, so I think that might be interesting. I apologize to students that already know that very well. So, okay, so should we proceed to Clara Schumann? Unless we have another question.
Yeah, I think we maybe could proceed.
Okay, all right. Now, since I don't know how much time we have, I just want to make a few general comments and then tell a little bit more about her biography. So since Hildegard led a cloistered life, the next person we're going to talk about is Clara Schumann. She lived in the world. And interestingly enough, she had a nickname, and her nickname was the Priestess. So I guess she was a different kind of priestess, and it had to do with her character because everything she did it with utmost passion and seriousness. But yet, she lived in the world, and in that sense, she was completely unique. So she was another great woman who made her contribution to art and to the world as a woman, because besides being a wonderful composer, one of the greatest pianists that ever lived, and also she was a mother. She had some eight children, and then she was also wife to one of the greatest composers that ever lived, is Robert Schumann. So I'm convinced that without her, he probably would not have been as creative as he did become. And then in her remainder of her life, she was the muse to Johannes Brahms, another greatest composer in all times. And of course, people read the letters that Johannes Brahms wrote to her. They make assumptions. They, at least at one point in their lives, they were lovers, and nobody really knows, and it really doesn't matter. And we also do know that she burned all her letters to Johannes Brahms. So I think we have to respect her privacy and leave this alone. But one thing that's absolutely indisputable, that she was a great influence on Johannes Brahms, that she was his muse, and she had a lot to do with his creative work. In fact, there's a sort of a curious story, because Johannes Brahms was friends with Robert Schumann, her husband, and Clara Schumann, and since they played for each other, and of course, when you create music, it becomes sort of part of you. For instance, he created a cadenza for a concerto by Mozart, and she was working on the same project later on. And then finally this work was published, and suddenly at one point she realized that a lot of those musical ideas actually came from Johannes Brahms. So she probably thought, oh my goodness, what have I done? So she immediately wrote to Brahms, and she told him that I think that those musical ideas came directly from you. Do I have to give you a credit? And him being a great gentleman, and of course seeing everything in context, he said, please don't bother, because if I would have to credit you for everything that you have done for my creative work, I wouldn't know where to start. And I'm sure he was speaking from the heart. So anyway, so I'm showing that she has been a great influence on her husband, Robert Schumann, and also on Johannes Brahms. And of course, since Robert Schumann was such a great composer, and he died relatively young, actually, as a young man, she was very much involved in publishing his works and making sure that everything was there for posterity. So that was another role in which she was involved. Then another thing that sort of became a contribution, and not every musician knows. For instance, when you go to a concert and listen to a piano recital, and usually there is a format. Oftentimes the concert starts with maybe a Baroque work by Bach or some other Scarlatti or something like this. Then the performer will proceed to a classical sonata by Mozart or Beethoven, and then the pianist will play something from the Romantic period, that is from the 19th century, and maybe conclude the concert with works that were written recently. So we kind of take it for granted, but actually this format created by Clara Schumann. Yeah, Clara Schumann was the one that came up with this idea, because during her lifetime, and the musicians before that, oftentimes just played the works that they wrote themselves, or the works that would show off their technical ability or other talents. So this whole idea of having a whole gamut of different compositions, that comes from Clara Schumann. So she designed that format. Now, as a person, so she was born into a well-to-do family, so it would seem like she would have a very comfortable life, but she had great many trials and tragedies in her life. So in that sense, her life has been extremely difficult. And now I think I'll proceed with the biography. So she was born in 1818 in Leipzig, Germany. And usually when we talk about Leipzig, we think about Johannes Johann Sebastian Bach, because that's where he worked. But there were, of course, other composers and other musicians that lived in Leipzig, and most notably it would be Robert and Clara Schumann. So, and her life became a pretty problematic right from the start, because she had a father who was a very contradictory person. On one hand, he has been absolutely superb piano teacher. He was probably one of the best pedagogues anywhere at that time. But on the negative aspect of his character, he was a very difficult person, and probably because of that, he went through a divorce when Clara Schumann was only, or Clara Wieck, when she was only 5 years old. So he was a kind of a driven and a controlling person. And early on, he realized that his daughter Clara had a tremendous talent. So he decided to make her a famous pianist. And it was a tradition at that time that if you had a great talent like that, then okay, if it's a boy, then you should kind of push him into making him a famous musician. But if it's a girl, then the effort may not have been made. For instance, if you think of Mozart, that's what happened there. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was pushed to become a great musician when his sister, Nannerl, who was also absolutely superb musician, she was not pushed into the limelight because she was a girl. Well, Friedrich Wieck, that was the father of Clara, he felt, no, the daughter, she should be this famous pianist. And then he chose the name Clara because it meant bright, or it also implied famous. So he started to teach her piano when she was 5, and the studies went very well. And besides teaching piano, he was also was responsible for her schooling. So she did not go to any public school. So you could say in modern language that she was homeschooled. And of course, her father, Friedrich, he was thinking about her future as a famous pianist. So the emphasis in her studies went in particular areas. So he was very interested that she would learn languages. And of course, there's a reason for that, because every musician that has a chance to become famous will have to tour and will have to go from city to city, from country to country, and then they should speak 4 languages. For this reason, she learned French and English, and she spoke both languages very well. And of course, her native language was German, which was the lingua franca at that time. So every educated person in Europe spoke German, and that lasted a long time. So German was a lingua franca in Europe until Second World War. And I think with the German defeat in Second World War, it came to an end. And then nowadays, lingua franca is English, of course. But anyway, so she knew her native German and French and English, and that, of course, was very important later on when she began to tour. Another thing that father very wisely considered, he knew that in order to be a very powerful performer, you have to be strong physically and emotionally. So the emotional strength is particularly important. And of course, if you're strong physically, then that helps your emotional strength. So he influenced all of his kids to make sure that every day they were outside taking a walk for at least an hour, preferably 2. And Clara Schumann subscribed to this regimen, and she was doing that all her life. And that's probably why she lived that long, because the life expectancy in those days was much shorter, but she lived into her 70s. And she imparted this habit to all of her children and grandchildren. And as I mentioned, she had 7 or 8 children, depends how you count, because some of the kids did not survive. All right, I did mention that when she was 5, she started piano lessons. And then the father felt that he could introduce her to the public at large. And when she was 9, she already had a concert. She played for a big audience with great success in Leipzig. Yeah. In 1830, when she was 11, the father decided that she should go on tour of Europe. And the plan was to conquer the most important city in the artistic world, which was Paris. So basically here, the father of Clara is doing what the father of Mozart did. Remember, Mozart was touring all of Europe when he was very young, because the idea behind it was to introduce young Mozart to all the greatest musicians at that time, which is to make him famous, also earn some money, but at the same time to learn and get acquainted with other great musicians. Well, here, the father of Clara is doing the same thing. And so on the way to Paris, Clara Schumann and her father stopped in many places. For instance, in Weimar, she had the honor of playing for aging Goethe. And then they made other stops, and they played for other famous musicians of that time. And she impressed all of them. And as they were continuing to go from city to city, they were also collecting recommendation letters, because once they reached Paris, they had all these recommendation letters that opened the door to play in aristocratic salons for selected audiences. And that's what happened. So she played those house concerts. And that's where she met Chopin, who had the highest regard for her. She also again met Mendelssohn, who actually worked in Leipzig, where she came from, but she met him again in Paris in another environment. And she even met Niccolo Paganini, so that she met the luminary. So this trip had been a tremendous success. And I already mentioned that later, when she was 21, or turned 21, she became a wife of Robert Schumann, one of the greatest romantic composers. And how did it start? Well, in 1830, while Clara was still a little girl, Robert Schumann was taking lessons from her father, Friedrich Wieck, and At the same time, Robert Schumann was a person of tremendous intellectual and artistic interest. So he was also studying literature as well as the law. And then he became part of the household. Somehow he ended up living with Friedrich Wieck and all the kids there. And in fact, that since the father was a very controlling and a rather severe person, Robert Schumann kind of was associated with great creativity and fun, when the father was associated with very strict discipline. And while Friedrich Wieck was the teacher, at the same time, of course, Robert Schumann, who was 9 or even almost 10 years older than Clara, had much more experience as a composer. And as a matter of fact, he helped her to orchestrate the piano concerto, which she played in quite a few places with tremendous success. And at this moment, could I ask Katie to play the piano concerto, to play the link that I sent? So that will be the piano concerto that Clara wrote when she was only 15 years old.
Yeah.
Would you play that?
Absolutely. Let me just.
Yeah, it's a long piece. We could just listen to the part of the first movement. You will see that the piece has great passion. It's a romantic composition, and technically, it's a very advanced work.
Okay. Let's see.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
Oops, no sound for some reason. I think we need the sound.
Are you not getting the sound?
No, I can see that. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one that's not getting the sound.
No, I'm not getting any sound either.
Oh, that is.
Should I try to share it? I could try to share it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a possibility. I also know I will for sure be posting these to the course after here.
Okay, let me see if we get the sound, if I share it. Will that work if I share this? Let me see. Okay, can share it. All right, I will try to share it. This thing. Okay, now share, screen share, share. There we go. I will pause right here so you got an idea. I want to mention, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Excellent. I want to mention that this concerto was written when Clara was only 15, and it was performed in Leipzig. And guess who was conductor? Felix Mendelssohn, another one of the greatest musicians and composers that ever lived. And that performance was a tremendous success. Now, I did mention that she later, when she was 21, married Robert Schumann. So how did it all happen? Already when she was 16, 17, she probably began to realize that she was falling in love with Robert Schumann. And well, it showed her power. Apparently, Robert Schumann was engaged to another woman, but somehow Clara managed to change that course of action, and Robert Schumann kind of dropped that in engagement. Now, when father learned that Clara wanted to marry Robert Schumann, he got really angry. He was dead set against this marriage because he felt that if they get married, her career as a performer is going to be ruined. And he also had concerns that Robert Schumann was emotionally unstable. Well, unfortunately, he was right about the second aspect. Robert Schumann did have emotional issues that affected him and, of course, the whole family greatly. But, of course, his opposition to this marriage have been extremely severe, so bad that he made a condition. He said that if you marry this man, you will not have the privilege of playing the piano that you played all these years. Anyway, you can tell that she made a very firm decision to get married with Robert Schumann. And, of course, as a result, her father and Clara became estranged. Later, they tried to make up, but it never lasted. And but she always gave her father credit for teaching her and helping her to become a musician that she was. Now, before the marriage, she had more concert tours, and the pinnacle of her career was the stay in Vienna in 1838. She was only 19 at that time. So Vienna, the imperial city that was probably second to Paris in terms of importance in the cultural world, fell under Clara's spell. Besides having great responses from all the music lovers, she was actually appointed an imperial and royal virtuosa. And we have to remember that she was three things that were not acceptable at that time. First of all, she was a woman. She was a royal virtuosa. She was a Protestant because in Vienna they're Catholics, and a foreigner. You know, all these three things. Never mind, she was accepted as their own, and she was the imperial and royal virtuosa. Now, in 39, just before getting married, she decided to go on a second tour to Paris, but it didn't work very well because father was working very hard to make sure that she will not be able to get married to Robert Schumann, and for this reason, she needed to interrupt her tour and come back to Leipzig in order to finish all the litigation. All right, so after they were married, they spent a couple of years in Leipzig. That's where their daughters, Marie and Elise were born. And they had, of course, nice and comfortable house, but only one grand piano. And here, while Clara did continue to practice and write compositions, she's still being an incredibly considerate person, a loving person. She ceded her time and the piano to her husband. And of course, she did it out of love, but at the same time, it was very difficult for her because music is something that she lived for, and it was hard for her not to play and not to compose. Nonetheless, she did it, but that's the kind of person she was. Nevertheless, in spite of that, she did continue to compose, and actually her husband encouraged her because he thought very highly of her talent. In fact, they composed a cycle of songs. I think there are 12 of them. And nobody knows for sure which songs she wrote and which were written by her husband, Robert Schumann. Well, that's the kind of composer she was. She wrote on the highest level. At the same time, now and then, she was insecure about it. And actually, when her husband passed away, and he passed away because he had emotional issues and he tried to commit suicide a couple of times. And finally, of course, he passed away. And after he was gone, she actually never wrote any other compositions. One may ask why that happened. I think it probably had to do with the heartbreak. And it also probably had to do with the fact that she embarked on her career as a piano virtuoso. Here, that's where her father wasn't right. She still had her technique and artistry. And of course, it is more difficult to make a living as a composer than it is as a performer. And that's probably why she focused on performing, and she kind of stopped writing music. Nonetheless, she, besides this piano concerto that you wrote, that you just listened to, she also wrote so-called chamber music. So that's the kind of music that you can play for a small group of guests or for your family, or you can play it in a concert. So I have a couple of examples. One of them is a piano trio. So let's see, the piano trio. I'm going to share the piano trio that she wrote. So piano trio is a cyclical piece in 4 movements. And as I mentioned, it could be performed at home, or it could be...
Stuff. We love stuff. There's some really great stuff out there.
Skip ad. We can do without it. All right, so that... Clara Schumann piano trio. It's in 4 movements. We'll just sample the first movement because we won't have much time. But you will see how well it's written. Okay, we don't have much time, so I want to mention that she became widowed at the age of 37, and her husband, Robert Schumann, died when he was 47. Of course, that was an incredible tragedy for her. And then from that moment on, she had to care for all her kids. There were more tragedies in the family. Like one of the boys had also mental illness, so he had to be hospitalized, and that was another tragedy. Another son who already had a family participated in the Franco-Prussian War, and as a result of this service, he developed addiction to morphine, and he was incapable of taking care of his family. So Clara became basically a parent to all of his kids, so she was taking care of all of them. And then coming back to Johannes Brahms, who was a dear friend, he tried to make her to be his lover, but apparently that didn't work. But they remained very close and intimate friends, so they corresponded, and she had a great influence on Johannes Brahms. So then probably one more thing, that she also became a professor at the conservatory in Frankfurt, and as such, he had students from all over the world, including this country, and she passed on her legacy of great musicianship to them as well. And that's probably in kind of in a nutshell what she has done in her creative life. So that was the priestess of music in the 19th century. Something that Hildegard did in 12th. So I think we're probably reaching the limit of our time. So if you have any questions about Clara, I will try to answer. And if I can't, maybe Kevin will know more about it because he knows quite a bit about Clara Schumann. Before anybody comes up with any questions, if there are any, I should mention, I was going to play 3 romances by Clara Schumann. I was going to do it live. Unfortunately, our pianist, Laura Dr. Artisani, is not available. She's teaching right now. But I want to mention that besides just reading about Clara and talking about her, I really enjoy playing her music because it's very delicate, it's passionate, and it's very rich. So when you listen to it, it sounds like melody and accompaniment. But the moment you listen more carefully or look at the score, you will see that there are usually 2, sometimes 3 different melodies going on at the same time. Of course, any composer can write several melodies at the same time, but only really great composers will make it sound in such a way that all of this sounds graceful, rather a very heavy contrapoint, just like an exercise. Yeah. So any questions? If we have a little bit of time, we could play a little bit of the piece that I was going to play live. Unfortunately, that's not possible, but we do have a link of this music, a YouTube link to this music. So what is the consensus? Are we out of time, or we have a couple of minutes for these 3 romances for violin and piano? Are there any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat, but students feel free to jump in. We do typically end around 4:50 or 5 p.m., but we definitely still have a few minutes.
Yeah,
I posted questions earlier. Can none of them be seen?
I did see Britton's question earlier. Let me get back to you. He had mentioned that his professor had taught us about how the sheet music of the time was different from what we have today. And Dr. Week mentioned that the notation was new technology. How different is it, and how is it translated, if it's translated at all?
Okay, of course, the best way it would be to demonstrate. I don't think we have the time, but I think I could quickly describe in words. So when the notation was invented, it looked like squares, and we had staff. And of course, today's staff, for staff, we have 5 lines. In those days, there were just 4 lines, and for the notes, you had squares that looked like that. Of course, I don't have very good writing. And what they did in Middle Ages, they did it beautifully, yeah. But basically, it was the staff and squares. The rhythmic notation was not invented. And of course, as the time went on, the rhythmic notation became part of the technique, but it took another couple of 100 years before rhythmic notation was invented. So the notation for works by Hildegard were basically those squares. Kevin, would you happen to, I'm sure you have it handy somewhere, or you're a medieval...
No. Well, I can, okay. Can you see this?
Sort of, it's kind of small. Okay. If we,
for example, this...
oh, there we go, yeah.
Okay, in older notation, these 2 notes would look like this.
That's right, yeah.
This note by itself would look like this. These 5 lines would be these 4 lines. It was a much more kind of graphic notation, these squares and the way they connected. This way of doing it showed a little bit more the horizontal relationship of the notes, the rhythm. Just one example, but...
Terrific. And what we can do, we can provide an example of medieval notation from 11th and 12th century, and also modern notation, and then you will be able to see it. So we will send it to Katie, and perhaps Katie can share it with the whole class. I can do it immediately. I don't want to do it right now because it may take me a minute to find it. I don't want you to sit and wait for that. But we definitely can share with the entire class. That should be no problem. That's an excellent question, because this is very important. Let me mention, like when it comes to music, and of course you have music from all countries. You have music from India, from Africa, from China, but somehow the music in Western Europe took a tremendous leap, and this is because of this system of notation. Of course, today it's worldwide, but it took a while before it became a worldwide phenomenon. And it was an absolutely tremendous invention. And here we can thank Guido from the town of Arezzo, Guido d'Arezzo, who invented this system. And this system for notation kept developing, becoming more sophisticated, but the principle of the notation remained the same. So basically, he came up with the best way of notating music, and we should all be very grateful to Guido. Thank you for the question. So it looks like we're out of time, unless anybody else has a burning desire to come up with another question. Otherwise, we could probably end right there. Yeah.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah.